Hey guys, I'm making these videos in response to some questions that I've been asked, and I thought a nice way to answer them would be just to give you my thoughts in video. So the first question that I've got here is introversion a product of nature or nurture? And are people born with an introverted personality, or is it something learned from parents and the environment as a baby or an infant, or is it in the DNA? So I want to start off with a comment that I've heard quite often in any workshop that I've run is anybody who's had a child, any parents or even aunts and uncles, or anyone who's been around a small baby is pretty convinced that that baby sort of came out with its own kind of thing, its own desires, its own personality. So that's something to keep in mind while I have this quick discussion. But I think the best place to start is to talk about the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who is the man who coined the term introversion and extroversion in the first place. And let's talk around what he meant when he said that. So he actually coined the terms introversion and extroversion with the model in mind that we are both introverted and extroverted at the same time, yet we either consciously prefer and demonstrate one, while the other is more of our subconscious sort of shunned aspect. So if we show extroverted behavior in the world, we have this introverted part of ourselves which is unconscious, and equally if we show introverted behavior to the world, if it's our preference, then we have got this extroverted subconscious part of ourselves that plays a force in our behavior, but that we don't necessarily identify with. So his model is that those two opposing forces are constantly interacting in the way that we process information, because introversion, extroversion is actually a term given for how we go about receiving stimulation from the world and processing the information from the external world. So if we experience it in our preference, we are still going to be influenced by how our subconscious one deals with that information, and it's the interplay and pull between the two that causes our behavior, our outward behavior. So that was his thinking initially. But that model and the terms introversion and extroversion have been adapted and iterated over time, so we've got lots of different great thinkers who've contributed to this, and one of the most popular one that I see people using a lot is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, for example, or another tool that I use which simplifies those 16 types in the Myers-Briggs down to just four, and it uses colors to describe them. But both of those models, Myers-Briggs and the one that I use most often, have changed Jung's initial thinking to, rather than opposing forces, introversion being on a spectrum, with extreme introversion on one end and extreme extroversion on the other end, and multiple points along the way, with even a midpoint which has now become known as an ambivert. So what Myers-Briggs and Clarity, my color model, say is that you don't occupy one point on the spectrum, you actually occupy a range. And Jung concurred. He said any such person who was a pure extrovert or a pure introvert would truly be insane, or something like that. So rather, you occupy a range. So say that's your range there. You're definitely dominantly on the introversion side of the spectrum, but some of your extroverted qualities sometimes are demonstrated, or you feel comfortable with them, which kind of mimics this idea that Jung introduced, where you've got this unconscious and conscious aspects of your introversion and introversion. Now, why have I gone into that 4-minute spiel? It's because it's quite important in answering the question, is it genetic or is it something that's nurtured into you? Well, the thinking is that you actually are all of them at any given moment, but because of your environment and because of your experiences, you are required to show up in a certain way. So actually, elements of yourself become pushed into your subconscious because they're not required, they're not necessary, or you are expected to behave in a certain way, and therefore parts of yourself become more expressed. So the answer is yes, you arrive on the planet with a certain disposition, but the reality is you're a combination of both. And the process of individuation, which is another Jungian term, is that over the course of your lifetime, you are integrating aspects of yourself which you prefer, so coming to terms with and being comfortable with what it is that you prefer to do, and how it is you prefer to behave, and how it is you prefer to process information, but also becoming fluent and comfortable with aspects of yourself that you don't prefer, ways that you don't prefer to process information, ways that you don't prefer to behave. And Jung actually said that this process of individuation is when you are able to be quite comfortable in both spaces. So what has now become called ambivert by more recent models is what Jung would have called individuated. So in short, the answer is it is a combination of both. There's a lot of interesting reading that you can find that gives information of studies being done where introverts tend to have a lot more brain activity in the cortex, whereas extroverts tend to have a lot more activity in the visual and the audio part of the brain, which would make sense because one of the definitions is how you respond to stimulation and how you respond to information. So introverted energy tends to be enjoy an inward focus, kind of conjuring up energy from inside, being very reflective, very much in the thinking part of the brain, whereas extroverts like to draw their energy and engage with the external world, and therefore that part of their brain would be more active. But people are not sure if it's because your brain was like that you became introverted or extroverted by preference, and I use that word very intentionally, or if because by preference you liked to get information like this, or you like to get information internally, that your brain developed that way. So there seems to be quite a complex interaction between the two. I'll definitely make another video describing a little bit more what I mean about preference, because that's a very important distinction. But I hope that's given you some food for thought on the nature-nurture. Bye!